a conversation with artist Torkwase Dyson and art historian Robert Shane, both of whom are extremely brilliant. We're also thrilled to have the poet Gabriel Palacios here today, who will read to close today's program and will be sharing a few poems with us as a special treat. The Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings unfolding across the country, following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAfee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Ria Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, and Toyin Salau, and in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. I introduce our phenomenal host. We'd love to begin with a brief moment of silence. And now to introduce today's host. Robert Shane received his Ph.D. in art history and criticism at Stony Brook University and is an associate professor of art history at the College of St. Rose in Albany, New York. Shane's art criticism has appeared in the Brooklyn Rail and the Shambhala Times, and his scholarly research has been published in the journal Hypatia. His current book project in process is Mirroring Mothers, Witnessing Maternal Subjectivity in Contemporary Art. Shane is formerly the managing editor of the journal Art Criticism, published by Stony Brook, and a frequent and fabulous contributor to art books published by Phaidon Press. Robert, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail for hosting this. It's an honor to be here. Torkwase Dyson is a painter working across multiple mediums whose compositions address the continuity of movement, climate change, infrastructure, and architecture. For Dyson, these subjects in relationship to each other produce abstractions that explore the history and future of Black spatial liberation strategies and environmental racism. Born in Chicago, Dyson began making art as an art minor at Tougaloo College in Mississippi, where she majored in sociology and social work. She went on to study at Virginia Commonwealth University and then finally took her MFA at Yale. Her work has been exhibited at the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the California African American Museum, and the 2019 Sharjah Biennial, among many other places. She is represented by Pace Gallery in New York. Her residencies and awards include the Graham Foundation Inaugural Fellowship in Chicago, a Joan Mitchell Foundation Painter and Sculptors Grant, Yaddo, and the Dorchester Project. Dyson's key theoretical project is Black compositional thought, which, in the artist's words, considers how paths, throughways, architecture, objects, and geographies are composed by Black bodies, and from these formations, it also considers how properties of energy, space, scale, and sound interact as networks of liberation. It is my great honor to welcome Torkwase Dyson to our conversation today.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail and all of the team. This is an amazing conversations you all have been hosting, and I've pretty much gone through so many of them and learned so much from my fellow artists and historians and poets. So I'm really sitting in gratitude and appreciation that you all are offering this to us while we're mourning and in solitude and staying close to friends and family. So I'm really excited to be included. So thank you. And thank you, Robert. It's been good to get to know you.
Yes, likewise. So let's start with looking at some work from your exhibition at Colby College, Maine in 2018. These are the first 7 slides, Miko. We could, I think, sort of just slowly scroll through them as we're talking. I'll give you a second to share the screen. So this exhibition, titled Nautical Dust, remembers Samuel Osborne, who was born into slavery on a Virginia plantation in 1833 and migrated to Maine in 1865. 2 years later, he began working as a janitor at Colby College and worked there for several decades. We see a architectural intervention, this ramp that's part of the space, and Zachary Fabry, a longtime collaborator of Torkwase's, performed O.A. Osborne's Ascent, which I think we'll see in the next slide. Torkwase, you've said that the design of our physical world informs the methods in which motion emerges and spatial strategies organized. For Black people, moving through a given environment comes with questions of belonging and self-determination, of visibility and semi-autonomy. One of the things that strikes me in terms of visibility, belonging, is the use of the mirrored surfaces in these pieces and in a number of works throughout your entire body of work. I was wondering what you're thinking about as you're using these mirrors.
Well, when we talked a bit about mirror as metaphor and mirror as idea of recognition, and how humans look to see themselves at a certain kind of, register around the world. But for my work, I use reflective surfaces in different ways to create conditions of refraction, create conditions of reflection, so that when the viewers enter the space, there's an inherent awareness of the architecture of the building, the architecture of the work, and the different surfaces in the paintings. And for me, having reflective surfaces allows, as the objects in the room sort of sit in a kind of stillness, the body and the audience and the movers sort of interact and become performers with the space as well. So, this idea of refraction and movement has to do with the conditions in which people move in the room, activate their senses, move improvisationally. And everyone is sort of becomes, as they look through and at and on and above and below, hopefully welcome. Work, and a lot of it is really about inviting different conditioned bodies into the space to move through and around and above. So the reflective surfaces, and I use them not as to create a one-on-one, but I use them to create different kind of spatial conditions in a given room. So you see reflections of moving images, you see reflections of the audience, of course. You also oftentimes see reflections of drawings or videos that happen in the space to open it up, to make it dynamic, and to invite improvisation from the audience.
I think the mirror also functions as this important place of subjectivity, particularly as you're creating spaces for Black subjectivities, spaces of belonging, for Black subjectivities to see themselves literally reflected in the mirror. Miko, could we look at slide number 4, please, of Zachary before this is one of the pieces at Colby College. And one of the interesting, this is on the side of the ramp that we were looking at earlier that's facing outward to the windows. And at this point, Fabry is very close to the image, but if you step back, the viewer doesn't actually see themselves in this mirror, right? It's refracting the space, as you said, and it is somewhat disconcerting to, every time we walk by a mirror, we glance in it, we expect to see ourselves, and it displaces the viewer, can make the viewer feel that they're lost, displaced, which I think bears witness to what you've called excluded subjectivities. So there's this play in which we're bearing witness to excluded subjectivities, but I think also finding oneself. The mirror has been such an important metaphor, from Narcissus to Lacan to work of Carrie Mae Weems of finding and seeing oneself. And I like how that's sort of coupled with this reflection of the architectural space, right? Because the mirror expands that space. And I think one of the things that your work explores is that subjectivity isn't just something that's happening intrapsychically, but it's happening within a social and physical space.
Well, the mirrors allow, in particular conditions of architecture where the geometries are shooting through a space, it allows the viewers to feel embedded, right? So there's a condition around a sort of body politic around being embedded in a space, right? So how do we join? How do we socialize? How do we come to each other in these sort of architectural spaces that are made to display art objects and become a part of that? And I think that the mirrors both in the work as they are physically, sort of changing the perspective of both the exterior of a building or the circular condition of a painting, all of these perceptions all of these conditions of perspective are constantly changing. So I think that's where the sort of interior comes from, right? So how do we create a space that welcomes a sociality? How do we create a space that welcomes and acknowledges the interiority? How do we create a space where both those things in public and private invite improvisation and understand that there's power and that there's a lot of places where improvisation, as we talk about public space, it was improvisations and the intelligence beyond, with improvisations are not acknowledged and invited out. So I think that as I make these installations, I'm trying to invite things out of the viewer. I'm trying to invite things out of the guest that not necessarily, or have necessarily been not regarded as something that is beautiful or about a kind of, freedom in a way. So I think it's about subjectivity, but it's also about recognizing the potential interiority of the individual who comes into a condition of refraction, right? So it's not about me as an individual, but it's about we, a space, a gathering, and it's about a kind of perception that is absolutely not a one-point perspective. It's absolutely not a 1 or 2 point perspective as we've learned to think about space, but it's something more dynamic and more dialectic, I think. So that's what I'm interested in as I use these mirrors as a part of both the architecture and also I'm interested in the way it bounces surface around, right? In a way that you can think something is flat and understand it to be flat, but see visual textures that make you, and you kind of want to touch these things. So that's what I'm thinking about as I develop a sort of geometry around, refraction.
Yes. Miko, could we have slide number 7? And yeah, that sense of kind of displacement, the opening up of the space, the way you see in this image, for instance, the tondos reflected in the geometric forms, is a kind of strategy I think we see throughout your work of finding moments of instability. We can be using that instability to critique or deconstruct oppressive structures. And then it also is liberatory, and that's opening up this improvisational space. Is that how you see instability working in your work?
Well, I think instability is tricky,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you can, I mean, politically, I'm not sure, I'm not sure I think about it directly in my work, but I think it's tricky as a condition in the sense that people who live in a condition of constant instability, that can be used as a weapon, and or instability can be used as a kind of condition where, or a tool for freedom.
So let's look at some of these images from PACE. This is 8 and 9, Miko. And perhaps we could scroll through these, and also your piece at the, your work at the Museum of Modern Art, part of the Pop Rally series, which will be in the next couple of slides, because here we really see people inhabiting the space, belonging to the space, and improvisation plays a vital role, particularly in the performances that we'll see, Miko, in slides 13 through 16. In these performances, you're working with Dark Adaptive, your artist collective composed of you, Andres Hernandez, and Zachary Fabry. How did the three of you get started working together?
Well, a few years ago, I was making a sculpture at Socrates Sculpture Park, and it was another ramp similar to the piece I had done at Colby, right? So the idea of the incline, the idea of movement, the idea of projection, geometry as projection is really sort of prevalent in these works that I make. So I saw Zach, and I'd seen him perform, and I'd asked him to make a performance at the work at Socrates Sculpture Park. And he had done so, and it was an amazing moment. And he understands, I think, improvisation in the way that really complements and brings something to the work about agency and about expression and about the kind of idea of immediacy and narrative with the body. So he has been very influential. Can you still hear me?
Yes, crystal clear.
Okay, fantastic. So my apologies. It's that threw my system in a little bit of a tizzy. So as this is a social condition, I ask everyone to be patient with me as we go back a little bit and recalibrate the energy of this entire conversation. Well, so as we recap, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to say, I heard from someone wise that we can use instability as a tool for freedom. So maybe like a ripe opportunity.
Yeah. So recalibrating this moment and saying hello again and saying, ideas of being in this moment of isolation and state-sanctioned terror and limited movement of bodies are always, the limited movement of bodies has always been policed on this American soil. So I want to take a moment to communicate that understanding as I talk about my work, and also call for a moment the lives of the indigenous people that were here and are here and thriving. So I was talking about ideas of refraction and reflection and space and movement as a way to think about the histories and geographies of people that have been and whose land has been dispossessed. So there's a simultaneity going on in my efforts as an artist to make work that is about concrete histories of free people having their lives stolen and taken and ruptured, and making abstract work, poetic work about liberties that people find through both improvisation, intellect, planning, and sociality, right? So in my work overall, as we looked at the Colby work in particular, when we look at Samuel Osborne, who was in the South and came to the North and worked on an institution, and in an institution called Colby College, and was very much visible and invisible, and labored there for years. And after his death, his obituaries talked about him as dark and being dark, and called him Darky. So as I, through my work, and I come up with these geometries, they also have, like I was talking about before, surfaces and textures of the haptic that bring the body in. So as Samuel Osborne came up from the South, moved to the North, labored in a white institution, and after passing, been talked about as something dark, like dusk. So dusk, for me, and that project identifies both something that we experience as human beings, sentient beings on the planet, but is also about distance and time and water. So nautical dusk, that language came out of ship language, came out of language that is about the ocean and the Middle Passage. So I want to give, even in this particular conversation, we started off with nautical dusk, and now we're on I Belong to the Distance, where again, I have geometries pointing towards water. And this particular water is the Gulf of Oman that's attached to the Indian Ocean, which in its relationship to the Atlantic Ocean, where it's very much about, again, labor, body, moving bodies and ships. So even though my research can be very much stabilized in these traditions of liberation, they're very much attached to liberation as it pertains to ecologies, ecosystems, natural environments, ideas of distance, time, and movement. So I recognize that we're on a digital format right now. I am talking into a screen, and I really want to take a moment in light of my ancestors to take this recalibration myself gently. So as I recalibrate myself and talk about this kind of ancestorship in this moment of continuous violence, and as we look at this image in particular at Sharjah, I want to make sure to acknowledge that this is a global condition, that there is no idea, I don't abide by ideas of universality, but I do abide by ideas of connection and similarities and languages that cross in attempts to liberate ourselves. So when we look at this work, and I was invited to the Gulf, I understand the conflict in the Middle East. I understand it only as an African-American woman who is very much embedded in African-American liberation. But what I learned, and what I learned from these abilities to travel geographically across the planet, is this idea of labor and resources and exploitation and liberties from that we're all in kin of that, right? So in this form of kinship, I do believe that these structures invite a sociality, a performance, a body in conversation, yes, using forms of the sundial to think about time and space and place. So if we could move to Zachary's performance, and Zachary, again, is a good friend of mine, a colleague, genius at movement and improvisation. I think that we as Dark Adaptive, myself, Andres L. Hernandez, and Zachary Fabry, we all recognize the importance of geography, water as geography, land as geography, body as geography, where we always want to stay connected to these ideas of liberation and distance, both physical distance, spiritual distance, distance in terms and in relationship to architecture and infrastructure, distance in relationship to memory and labor and freedom. So we were invited to Sharjah to make this work, and I chose to be at Oman because of the specificity of the geography there, where you have very much a history of the slave trade, where, you know, bodies were taken from East Africa to bring to the Indian Ocean and were used to pearl dive. So these pearl divers who came from the continent over to the Middle East is only one part of a history of agriculture and trade and extraction and development that is riddled with the way in which, you know, industrialized extraction happens. And that puts us in a similar conversation. As artists, we're all interested in those histories that really keep us honoring, you know, bodies of those histories and bodies of today. So I hope I'm recalibrated and caught up, and I apologize that I'm not, that I got knocked out, but I'm present now.
And actually, I think this would be a good moment maybe to turn to your work on the environment and the plantation scene. And we can maybe circle back toward at the end to some of the drawings at the Graham Foundation, which we had just showed briefly, but maybe we'll look at those at the end with respect to some of the recent work and the haptic. So let's see, let's turn perhaps to slide 34. And some of the environmental work. So the plantation scene is a term used by Donna Haraway and others, anthropologist Anna Tsing. Sophie Sepp Moore describes it this way: in invoking the plantation scene in this way is at once a provocation and a reflection meant to challenge the species level thinking of the Anthropocene. It makes visible power relationships and economic, environmental, and social inequities that have made ways of being in a world undergoing rapid climate change, accelerated species extinction, and growing wealth disparity more precarious for some human and non-human beings than others. The notion of the plantation scene reveals that the Anthropocene had always been racialized in ways that the term Anthropocene masks by turning to species level thinking. It also shows the way in which the logic and the structures of the plantation and the plantation economy, particularly within a global capitalism, are still operative today. So you've been working, fighting against this in a number of works, the work at Sharjah. Actually, did you want to go back to the video of Sharjah? Because that kind of relates to the waterways and to the environment. Did you want to play a clip of that video?
Let's keep going.
Okay, sure.
And we can maybe circle back.
Okay, great.
Something later.
Yep.
So what we're looking. Oh.
Yep. Oh yeah. I was going to say, go ahead. So tell us what you're doing in some of these solar works and the relationship to place.
Can we go back one image? Okay. So when I first became aware of the way in which we were using resources to power public and private spaces that were unsustainable, coal, oil, I also understood the history of plantation slavery, and cotton plantation was another agricultural condition that was also unsustainable. So I began to think about resources and energy and the ways in which, again, sociality, publics can happen in relationship to light and renewable energy. So I began to really kind of play with solar technology. And then I show this piece because it's the first work I've ever done where I used an off-grid solar system where we had a small battery bank, and I created, which was a loving friend calls the grass knoll. So through this project, through this public installation, I taught myself what does it mean to create a solar array, attach it to a battery bank, light a space, and in a public space, provide people with free electricity. It was a small model, but it was a model nonetheless. And can we go to the next slide? So we set up a situation where, you know, the piece could, you know, be illuminated at night. We had our battery bank, we had our converter, but what this was for me, who was trained as a painter, was really a learning curve to think about and go through the experience of really providing public with free energy, free renewable energy. And it was short, it was a test, and it failed in a lot of ways because the thing itself wasn't sustainable because of the artistic infrastructure that was around it, right? So it was a great moment to make a small thing, you know, learn about the capabilities of these technologies, and then move it to something that could talk about ideas of movement that were going on in my work anyway. So I took this moment, I don't even remember when this was, it had to be over 15 years ago. I took this moment to think about public nomadicity and movement even further. So we can go to the next slide. So what I'd begun to do was think about architecture. It was my first sort of venture into architectural spaces. In this particular piece, this is where I started making places that could be shared. This piece is a small piece that was a half of a Quonset hut that Theaster invited me to make in the back of his house in 2010. So I had, you know, been talking to him about this idea of solar energy, renewable energy spaces for people to create something around architecture and modularity. And I had no sense of what that meant. So I went there and built this half a Quonset hut with Theaster's team to figure out more about solar energy, to think about architecture like I'd never thought about it before. I knew architecture as a general form in the West was never built for Black bodies. So I wanted to make something that invited these kind of questions of what if we had a space that was embedded with us, by us, with our needs and with our senses and sensibilities, and then use it with that embeddedness inherent in the space, use it to create other kinds of conditions. Can we go to the next slide? So I made it for myself as a studio, but then invited other artists. This is Gabriel Harris, a sound artist, and I invited artists in particular who used electricity in their work, right? So I was listening to DJ Spooky's talk the other day and thinking about Black artists and poets who deal with electronic music. So I opened the space up, I invited people in, and then they had, in Studio South Zero had studio visits, and we had very small to large audiences come in and listen to Gabriel. But what was happening for me, I learned what kind of energy she needed to power her work day and night. Can you go to the next slide? right? So Diaster allowed me to put my solar array on the roof of which was then the Candy House. This was before the new building was built. I expanded my battery bank. So again, using this idea of renewable energy to teach myself how to think about solar technology and the equipment behind it. And this was now 2010. But also at the same time, learn more about nomadic architecture and architecture mobility. So I had really practiced in a way in this public space, a space that was offered to me by another artist. Can we go to the next slide? And so this is another moment where the half a Quonset hut was illuminated at night. Most of the materials I salvaged around Chicago. Some of it I brought with me from, I don't know, everywhere. I mean, this little place is very much a hodgepodge of materials that I loved. I learned so much about structure and infrastructure in small building and places through this work. So I was using, and at this time I wasn't making paintings. So I was using this time to really teach myself another field in this small way. But it was the sort of pursuit of clean energy that allowed me the questions, really the critical questions about architecture and sociality and public space. So this was happening, and I was learning more about drawing, particularly architectural representational drawing. And I was learning more about what does it mean to think about habitation of one or many, but with my hands, and very immediately so. So we can go to so this was the first Studio South Zero. So this was my first sort of test of this space. So we can go to this. So this is the second Studio South Zero, where it, I learned to put these small spaces on wheels, basically. But what I enjoyed and what made me feel alive was that I had a fidelity to renewable energy now, that I could pack it up and share it. And I could also make another space for people. So the way I made the space became more tailored to the people who were to use the space. So this is a piece called In Conditions of Fresh Water, where Danielle Purefoy, who is sitting in the chair on the right, invited me. She was a doctoral fellow at Duke at the time, and she was studying, I'll say, the infrastructural rights of Black people in the Black Belt. So we'd gone from North Carolina to Alabama, interviewing people who were having conversations about their community and their land and new infrastructures that were coming into a new, or I would describe it as a new colonization of the South, right? An expansion of, economic industries and trains, new train stations, and new kinds of infrastructures in relationship to old undeveloped infrastructure. So questions of water and health and displacement were all of these kinds of issues that Danielle was looking to talk to people about in her ongoing work. So she asked me, could we collaborate? And I said, yeah, what do you need? She's like, I need a microphone. I got her a microphone. We need desks. I got her a desk. I need a chair. I got her a chair. So Studio South Zero became her office, and we would drive it, and whatever she needed, I'd put inside of it. So, and when I didn't participate in the interviews, I was really very adamant that I was Danielle's, I served her and her needs and her work and her research. So when she wasn't there, she wasn't using it, I'd make drawings in it. But when I was using it, I'd leave it open, people could come in. But for the majority of the time, Danielle used it, and I would, sort of sit to the side, make sure the solar cells were working well, make sure the technology she needed was there, made sure She had lamps and fans and all these things. In each community we drove to, all of these kind of relationships got built and made strong because we were practicing autonomy and semi-autonomy, which is the question all liberated people always ask. So yeah, that's Studio South Zero.
And it's also a way of taking the your homage to historical Black geniuses who have employed the hyper shape in these nomadic ways to produce self-liberation, now in a form that's mobile and becomes a place to generate new art forms. I see some of the you have some of the drawings on the wall in this image, and I thought maybe we could turn to some of those Graham Foundation drawings, and then also to the recent the recent work that you've been doing with the haptic. Maybe kind of pair those with each other. We've, as an audience, we were looking at the Graham Foundation installation earlier. Could we, Miko, go to slide 18?
Oh, I see what you're talking about. So let me try to loop this back around in a way that it's graceful for people who don't know my work. So what Rob is referring to is this idea that I'm trying to develop, and it's a form that I, for lack of a better term, right now I'm thinking about as a hypershape. And the hypershape is geometry culled from history of Black liberation, particularly Box Brown, Anthony Burns, and Harriet Jacobs. So what you find when you think about these histories, you see that each one of these individuals self-liberated through a kind of architecture, whether they found the architecture or built the architecture, right? For instance, Box Brown built the architecture, Harriet Jacobs found the architecture. So what I'm doing is thinking about these ideas of, again, improvisation, infrastructure, architecture, and thinking through, as a painter, a system that I'll need to produce something that paintings and drawings that reflect that liberation, that reflect that freedom, that reflect that knowledge, that reflects that sense of movement and insistence on liberation by any means necessary. So what I've done is taken those three geometries and married them together in an abstraction. I think that to a great extent is a sort of infrastructure in the studio that helps my paintings, right? So I take these three geometries and I listen to music, as I often do when I'm trying to evoke a sense of improvisation that I can't necessarily do on my own at the moment. So these came out of 1-minute drawings, listening to Cecil Taylor, right? So it's wet work. I use gouache. I take these large brushes and I sort of go at these 9x12 pieces of watercolor paper. So they're all very quick. They're fast. I don't overthink them. They're usually no more than 3 marks. And they're all wet. I let the wet work dry and then I go over them with ink. So then what happens is that there's these ink drawings then become, these ink marks become very much about a rectilinear condition. So as I build these sort of rectilinear marks on top of this wet work, what emerges for me as an artist is a sense of perception, again, of what it means to think about movement and distance and pressure and ideas that are really paying homage to and regarding a kind of Black liberation strategy that we always constantly need. So I don't mean to reference these histories directly. What I mean to do is bring them into my work, create a poetic abstraction, and understand that I am in the register of belonging to those histories. So yeah, that's what the hypershape is for me. It's a system that I've constructed in my studio, where when I wear the hat of a geometrist, I can create abstractions that are from a kind of lexicon or a kind of idiosyncratic language that I've developed, and then use them to make something I think that I want to share with the world that says, hey, what is it again about this interiority? What is it again about reaching for a moment of vision outside of oneself, and to connect with these histories that are ongoing? You know, it's an urgency that I feel that I needed to respond to in my work, but I needed it to have a sort of ontology that was very different than the histories and the ways of becoming I learned in this sort of Western world, right? By way of all other kinds of systems. So the hypershape is, again, a working term that helps me figure out my own geometry in my work.
There's a trans-temporal quality to that. You talk about beginning your work from a state of deep subjectivity in these drawings, aligning your thoughts with Black spatial strategies. So there's this connection to the histories, bearing witness to them, an embodiment of them as you're working with the shapes that ancestors' bodies have inhabited. But as a liberation strategy, it's also creating a yet to be determined future, a future to become. However, I know you prefer to, instead of talk about time so much, you prefer distance. So the work at Sharjah was I Belong to the Distance. You have a number of works with distance in the title. What is it about the concept of distance that you get that you can't get from, say, a notion of space or time?
Can we move forward a slide? One more, I'm sorry. Okay. So often when I'm talking about the work, because it can be discussed under the umbrella of something temporal, I completely understand that. But what I'd like to think about in relationship to distance and these liberation strategies is what does it mean to imagine the distance? What does it mean to think about a kind of structural condition of globalization, and in globalization in this sort of macro way, but in relationship to geography, but also sort of the quotidian in relationship to intimacy. So oftentimes in my work, I'm trying to get at something that hasn't been asked before. So when I think about these histories of liberation today and then, I wanted to set up a condition or a question that I needed to figure out that wasn't about time, that in the question in itself set up a different understanding that then I could bring into a form and communicate the very tension of distance, like going from one place to another, movement from one site of intimacy to another site of complete dispossession. And because of the whole conversation about climate migration and the future of climate migration and the history of self-emancipation. I'm more interested in thinking about distance as it relates to liberation and movement, in the work at least. So it brings a sense of tension to my surface. It brings a sense of urgency to the geometry. It brings a sense of projection that lends a kind of force, right? So, and I don't know, I'm not sure where this idea of distance I did not realize that last year and the year before, I spent so much time thinking about distance. And I didn't realize or know COVID would sort of drop upon us. And everyone is talking about this idea of distancing, right? So this sort of moment where we're social distancing, I'm struggling with around that language because I have been thinking about distance in another way, right? And so, and that's okay. I'm still struggling with it, and using that word so frequently in relationship to, you know, the history and of movement of peoples all across the planet, by choice and by force. What does it mean to think about distance in that way? And to understand that those distances are related, very much related to climate change, very much related to the, what we talk about in the plantational scene. So I'm very careful, I'm still very careful and cautious around conceptualizing distance in the way that informs my work.
I think distance, as opposed to a sort of abstract notion of Euclidean space or time, affords a way to talk about, well, it's relational, right? So as you were talking, moving through distance, but also a relation across time. So a distance in time can be traversed in a work that brings, say, Fabri's body in contact with Osborne's, and your work acts as a kind of conduit that to close that distance or bring these two bodies together.
Well, let me say something about, because
Sure.
you dropped Euclidean in there. I just want to decolonize that. I want to point to distance and movement and architecture and a shape language that I learned and I think about through African nomadic architecture. So I'm thinking about the Tuareg women who create these modular architectural conditions with their body, with materials, with the idea of kind of impermanence. So what does it mean to belong to a people who their existence is a nomadic existence, so that other ideas of permanence and impermanence and stability and instability can live in relationship, in relation to the environment that you're embedded in. So I need to go back and maybe recalibrate and self-direct this a bit to say that those are the kinds of histories. So the idea of time is completely different. It's a non-Western condition. And so ideas of distance in relationship to peoples on the continent who are very much acutely already in relationship to sustainable living and helping each other move and transverse geographies in that way. So at its core, my work and my happiness and my joy and my research really comes out of finding more about how, you know, first people's work, embody and movement in architecture moves. So that's what makes everything liquid. You know, I have these structures, but what makes everything liquid about my work are these histories of being Black and being in relationship to a continental intelligence, the intelligence of the continent, right? So that, I just want to make sure that that bend and that curve in these geometries in the hands of, you know, a Tuareg woman, you know, that's a kind of magic, so.
Yes. Thinking of this liquidity, maybe we could turn to a kind of literal liquidity and movement in the in some of the video clips we have of your most recent work. So the past few months, you've been working on some animated drawings and also performances that we'll take a peek at in isolation. And while there's always been organic and expressive elements in your painting and sculpture, those seem to have always been in relationship to or contained or tempered by the geometries that you've been talking about. So there seems to be a new shift happening in this work, and I was wondering where it fits in terms of your larger ongoing theory of Black compositional thought.
Yeah, so I think I'll just talk about sort of this moment in time and the most recent state-sanctioned murder. And when each time I experience, I'll say this. So as you know, I went to Tougaloo College in Tougaloo, Mississippi. Before I was at Tougaloo, I was in Chicago. So I went from Chicago to Mississippi to Virginia to North Carolina, from Chicago so I traversed these southern states and understood, and northern and Midwestern states, and then the North. So understood what it meant to live in different places in the United States where, you know, violence was in the fabric of the police, which meant it was in the fabric of the economy, which meant it was in the fabric of the capital condition there. So this sort of super capitalism and the violence of racism and the terror of white supremacy it always reveals itself. It never goes away. It always reveals itself in this way that shocks some, does not shock most. So in this moment, we were already inside, we were already sort of distancing, and I needed to figure out how to really deal with what I was seeing in terms of Black body now, right? In relationship to the history of Black bodies. So I turned to my desk. I got really, in my apartment in Harlem, I made things very small. I sat at a table and literally started drawing and needed more. I needed something to do with my hands. I needed, from all of the screen work, I needed the haptic right away. I needed to put some immediacy in my life. I could not depend on the infrastructure of my studios. I couldn't depend on, you know, ordering or getting different materials and preparing for things. I needed to sit and draw and make at that moment. So these animations come out of a moment where I needed improvisation. I needed to embody what it meant to be alive and touch and stay grounded. So all of those animations are made in one, maybe two sittings. They're all made, you know, with my camera And they have been a real moment of meditation for me, because as I'm making them, I'm listening to Dion Brand, I'm listening to Angela Davis, I'm listening to Robin Kelly, I'm listening, and I needed to, in lieu of moving around, I'm a scuba diver, I walk, I move around the planet, and I needed to feel, liquid. I needed to feel earth. I needed to make space. So those kind of come out of a need to, and I missed, being touched, right? So they came out of all of those things, and they're still coming out of those things. So I really can't at this moment explain what they are, what they do, or how they work. I just know that they're new in my practice, and I'm going to make them as long as they make me feel right.
I think that's a beautiful spot of like ambivalence and hope to transition to the Q&A. Robert, how do you feel?
Yes,
Would that
I'm
work?
sure the audience has many questions for
we've had some like really remarkable questions. So our first question is coming from Deanna. Deanna, I'm going to turn on your audio now, and then you can, yeah, perfect.
Hi, thanks Malvika. Thank you to the Rail once again for a wonderful lunchtime conversation with Torkwase. And Torkwase, I'm really honored in that I had the honor and privilege to hang your work at the Drawing Center, those drawings, and those were fantastic. The surfaces, I mean, you can't really tell by looking at them on the screen, but their surfaces are really lush. Anyway, my question actually is regarding the idea you raised earlier, this concept of instability being a tool for freedom. And I wonder if you could talk more, like expand on that, please.
Sure. Well, I think, I know, right, that one thing, or one of the many things about degradation is to fix something, lock it in, to think that you can measure it, and anything outside that measurement really undercuts the kind of dominating power that you're trying to create. So for people that have, systematically, through film, through law, through image, been fixed, right? To destabilize that, or to behave, to perform, and to create conditions where that destabilization really rocks, or I'll say shutters, those things that are trying to, those conditions that oftentimes try to fix you, that can be a mode of resistance. That can be a mode of refusal. To employ a condition of destabilization upon someone who is only tried to fix you as one material or non-human is a way to get out of that, and to destabilize a kind of economic condition that is built on non-renewable resources. What does it mean to destabilize or unkeep or undo? So that's what I mean by it can be a tool of resistance when it's deployed for justice and to attain a kind of morality that is inherent in your own being when other people are trying to erase that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it does flesh it out more, and I very much appreciate the dimension that can be sort of suggested through the physicality of the work too, and how it may confuse the bodies of the spectators or the audience, and cause them to question a whole host of things. So thank you.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Our next question comes from our very own JC. JC, you can announce yourself any moment.
Torkwase, Robert, thank you so much for this conversation. And Torkwase, I'm so glad you came back to us. It has been lovely to spend time with your work. So I've been thinking a lot recently kind of in general, but particularly in the last week with Elijah Weatherspoon's kind of mysterious death in the waters around Charleston, that there's this really strong, quiet history of Black Americans trying to reclaim, fighting to reclaim the ocean as a space, kind of like outside of the Middle Passage. That there's like the wade-in protests, and sorry, I'm getting like so sidetracked. I have a lot of things going on, but I guess I'm really interested in how you think about the ocean. I really love the nautical dusk piece and the I come from a distance piece. I think that's what they're called. And to hear you talk about scuba diving, like I'd love to hear about how you're thinking about the subaqueous and then the ocean as a space that you kind of inhabit and work with.
No, sure. Catherine McKintrick talks about ocean as geography. And I understand it as a complex place where we now had been riddled with extraction. I also understand it, the peoples in the Carolinas, in the Gullah region, understand water as culture, right? So, and the history of water as metaphor and water as a way back. So, and all of the poets who are, you know, in relation to movement and water and how that language comes out. So I'm interested in that, right? So the scuba diving comes from wanting to see, you know, what extraction points look like. What does it mean to have an artificial reef? What does it mean I have a slide of it. What does it mean to physically take my body to this ginormous extraction point in the middle of the ocean and in the Gulf Coast mainly, because that's where my people, you know, are from. So next to New Orleans, next to Texas, and to get out there and see by means of these artificial reefs, those sites that disseminated marine life actually and ironically become a site where marine life is now gathering because coral reef has attached to the bottom of these extraction points. So what does it mean to understand that kind of cycle of condition of lived experiences? And what does it mean to understand how water works in relationship to culture, in relationship to memory, and then relationship to a contemporary space of, so yeah, that's a photograph that I took. So all of these, this is, we have to, I have to in my work understand ecology and geography as an ongoing condition of Blackness. So when I go to the ocean now and go out to these points, I understand the distance that I have from my ancestors, but I also understand that their bodies, their energies, their essences are absolutely wrapped in those regions. So when I go to see this concrete, right, where you see the architecture on top, you see the infrastructure on the bottom, and then beneath that water, you see droves and droves of marine life. That kind of complexity on my body is translated into the paintings, right? So I know what water is 100 feet above me feels like on my body, right? I know the weight of that. So when I you know, think about scale in relationship to the paintings, but scale also in relationship to industrialization, right? And as we try to move towards something of a democratic industrial condition, as we try to do these things, we have to keep how we understand scale. And women in the Gullah who understand the water as culture, and as our sea levels are rising, and that culture is now being very much compromised and disproportionately compromised around the planet for people of color, what does it mean to, understand those complexities, right? So that's the liquidity in the work. It's the water in the work. It's the ocean in the work. It's the Atlantic Ocean. It's the Indian Ocean. It's the rivers. It's the pond. It's the meadows. All of these things that we all belong to, no matter the distance, right? So it's so I think it's imperative that we all over the planet who have life in water, recognize it and know that it's know that it's a life force, and continues to be.
Absolutely. Thank you. The idea of feeling the weight of 100 feet of water on your body and kind of alchemically transforming that into knowledge is really, thank you. Great answer.
I love that. Our next question is coming from Sheila Pepe. Sheila, I'm asking to unmute you now.
Unmuted.
Hi, Sheila.
Hello, my dear. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to see your face.
I'm so happy to see your face and hear your voice. So, first of all, I want to say I haven't heard you talk about your work either in a long time, or there's a lot of discursive material that I don't know. So if I'm retreading worn territory, please forgive me. First, I want to say, I'm going to take a while here. Sorry, guys. First, I want to say that this is the most, in Europe, we'd say gestalt. This is the most well-integrated body intellect, I'm going to call you a sculptor, of art forms that I have seen in a tremendously long time. So the embodied intellect, the cerebral body is, you are making works that exist in their own private categories, but speak to each other in a way that that I think is fully sculptural, because sculpture is fully architectural, fully something, fully culture. You're making culture. You're making art, but you're making culture. And I say that because of your ability to describe it so well. So I'm going to say this. Here's my question. And it's like, please riff on this question.
Okay.
One of the best things about this work is how well you repossess and realign formal art, the formal aspects of art making. And so you're shuttling between many things. I feel deeply is the fluidity is about coming from this intergenerational space of, I'll say, transport. And your art making and art objects, and this idea of sustainability is so embodied that there's no parallel for it now that we have to do all this stuff by Zoom. Somebody take us to the minute. And so I want to reoffer something that we talked about a lot in the 90s, which was parallax. And wonder what happens now that you're forced to use your eyes so much more than, it's like an antidote to, or the other thing. And maybe riff on this idea of parallax works while we are distanced physically and having to stream through this thing we have right here, whatever it is we're doing right here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I was talking to someone the other day about this condition of being inside and being inside, but moving around and not, I'm sorry. Moving around in a way that is very measured. And what I've been doing is, can we go to maybe the last slide, everybody? So what I've been doing is trying to, again, take the things that maybe are 5 feet from me and use the things I already have. The last one, yeah. The last, is that the last one? Sorry, the last video. And
The ones we just saw.
Yeah, and really going into a place where I've been afraid to go. I'm sorry, not that. That's the animation. I want the middle video. Sorry, yeah. So Dion Brand talks about in the Blue Clerk, this idea of the left hand. Like, what are the things that you would never, that I would never do?
Yeah.
And what are the things that I haven't really thought about? And what do I have, right? And that keeps the creative condition generous, and keep offering and keep trying to stabilize my own emotions when all of this hate and violence and dispossession is happening, right? And how do I use my own safety and my own resources to go in my own creative self, not think about it as a limitation, but think about it as there's somewhere in there you haven't gone in a long time. So I made this video thinking about there's someplace I hadn't gone in myself in a long time. I have this building, you know, it's an empty storage building. I have a good friend of mine, Sheila Ha, who makes these body sculptors. And I have this 46-year-old body. And I used to, you know, I majored in ballet in high school, and I was trained under, you know, a condition of many African dance traditions in Chicago, you know, mainly Montu. And I needed to really face who I am as an adult artist that had something else that needed to come out. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to, with this condition, dig into what is already inside of me, right? And listen closer to people I've listened to before, right? And to reread and rethink about someone like Keith and Mindy Obadike, you know, to revisit poetry that really, some of the reasons why I have the tattoos that I have, like these older memories of the body that I felt really self-conscious about, and movements and ideas that made me feel messy and vulnerable, you know, and pull those things out, right? In a moment that allowed and invited my continual presence, and also allowed me to stay connected to what I was already learning, you know, and the people that I'm constantly learning from. So, and being able to share that, you know, and circle it around, and even encourage my friends to do work. I know these aren't the conditions. I know they're not the best conditions, but what can we find as living sentient beings that's already in there, you know, to exacerbate even more, to be in the unknown, and to know that my whole existence is creation. That's it. I can't do anything else. I'm not good at anything else. I'm a shit sometimes. So that's it. This is all I have to offer. So, and stay connected and help these conversations move on. How do we be together, you know? And I think the way we be together right now is to go inside of ourselves and dig out places that we hadn't seen in a long time, and then share that with someone else. So everything is anew. Everything is an introduction. You know, that's what we have, I think, to pull out histories and embodied experience and share them with our colleagues, you know, and risk that. So that's my riff on that, you know. I wish I could hug you. Yeah. So the last time I saw you, we were in Florida.
Sheila's saying something, and I'm gonna.
Sorry. So I just want to say that what I get from that is you will not be reduced to an eye. You will not be reduced to only seeing in parallax, which is the best riff ever. Thank you.
No.
Oh. Our next question comes from a number of members of the audience. I'll mention, comes from Deanna, comes from Jenny, and a number of other people who mentioned in the chat that they wanted to hear more about architecture not being hospitable or being antagonistic to Black bodies. And obviously it's not on you right now to teach a master class in like public space and antagonism, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this question of place, which you also flip and you articulate as an invitation. So you said, what if we had a place that was for us, built for us, for our inherent needs and sensibilities? And when we spoke before, and I shared with you like all my questions about your time at Yale, and you know, institutions that take on a kind of aggressive character, you said something that like really was really brilliant to me. That is that to you, that you have all these, because you have all these spaces that you're embedded in already, coming in, like coming out of like a historically Black college, coming out of your time at Portobello, at these like African Panamanian communities, your time in Ghana, that by the time you got to Yale, it felt like you were visiting someone else for 2 years and just like observing like whatever the hell was going on in their house. And I think that's like really healthy and refreshing. And I was wondering, sorry, this is so long. I was wondering, as a person who lives in space, obviously, but also lives as a space maker, if you could talk more first about the inhospitability of architecture in public space to and for Black bodies, like just materially, tangibly. You don't have to like teach the whole thing. And then second, I'm interested in hearing about those spaces that you've been embedded in, which have been built sort of for the inherent needs of Black people, what those spaces have been like and how they are built to do that materially, tangibly, whatever.
So I'm going to give a direct answer to the first question. That's something I experienced. I was invited to come to Philadelphia and work with the Mural Arts program. And what I realized is that and this is really specific, and there are a ton of examples like this, that the Mural Arts program was an anti-graffiti program, okay? So, and through my eyes. So what that meant was that not only do we have cities that have been designed in relationship to labor, a hyper and modern form of colonization and imperialism, you know, through the ways in which these cities have been built and stripped, and through the way industry in this country has been built and shipped and stripped and dismantled, right? From the institution of chattel slavery. All of it has been, all of the building, all of the cities, all of the suburbs has been built in service of hypercapitalism. So if that is true, then the buildings are built for that as well, right? So they're built for the servant, the other, to live in annex of. And you know, Mabel Wilson talks about this, like how are these spaces built for the other. And in that otherness, they isolate, they divide, they lack light, they hide bodies. This is Monticello, right? All of these kinds of underbellies. So our bodies are not embedded in this soil. They're not embedded in this architecture. The well-being of these conditions have nothing to do with us, right? So when I learned the depth of this anti-graffiti campaign that was then, I think, sort of appeared as a mural campaign, as if the representation of, you know, lived experience of brown people could measure the representation of a culture that talked about language, that talked about a kind of clandestine being, that talked about a kind of freedom, from New York to Philly, this famous saying of all city, going all city with transportation. So there's something that was created from the necessity of freedom and liberation that was then sort of erased and tamed and made conservative with a kind of representational condition in and hosted by buildings. This is what I'm talking about. The sort of aggressive invisibility of Blackness and brownness through a kind of false liberal condition, through a kind of false complete visibility, as if portraiture can do that in a particular kind of way, right? So, I mean, and this is just one really close to my heart antidote, because it was so shocking, to understand the strategy of replacing, graffiti with conservative portraiture. Like, what does that mean on buildings, inside of buildings that these children live in and move out of? So you're talking about outside the outside, and I forget the talk that I was listening to at Duke, but the premise was being outside the outside. And so I'm very constantly troubled by that. And I know teenagers belong to the streets. That's where they are. That's where they can be. They belong to, the ways in which the outside works. That's where they play. That's where they live. That's where they breathe. That's where they sing. That's where things are made. So the interiors that they come in, and, depending on what that condition is, can love them or not. But either way, those interiors aren't historically built, in a way that intends to create a revolution against, capital racism, So that's one way. And that these histories are just built, from Monticello to Philadelphia, it's all in there, From a different way to answer the second question is that, what does it mean to insist that the places that you occupy, the Black body is embedded in the architecture that wasn't built for you? Well, it takes work, it takes labor, and it takes understanding infrastructure and architecture and building and materials. It takes changing the walls. It takes painting it takes song. It takes a kind of both sociality and hard science to recreate a completely new condition for another kind of lived belonging, right? So how do we offer, outside of hyper-capitalist condition of ownership and space and these oppressive architectures, and understand that how do we get something that wasn't meant for us? How do we get embedded into it? Now, that is a kind of erasure and an instability that needs to happen. Not erasure, I'm sorry. That is a kind of instability and an unkeeping that needs to happen. And then you replace it, you replace it with thought, Black thought. That's it. Just if to be left alone, let's talk about Tulsa. Just to be left the fuck alone, right, is a way in which these things thrive, right? The way in which we thrive, just to be left alone. So because I come, from Chicago, which is already a segregated city. I went to schools that were built for, you know, beautiful Black children, you know, and to say that the same way I think about, you know, I mention this all the time, indigeneity, children, what do we speak? What do we say to each other? What kind of songs do we sing? What kind of, you know, what kind of, I won't say math, I'll say, because that's colonial. I'll say, what kind of equations do we exist with to build our spaces open? You know, what kind of industrial democracy with kindness do we create, you know, in a small scaled way, right? So the embeddedness is the understanding that, you know, community, education, creativity, expansion, trade, bartering, resources, food, all of these things have to belong to the people who occupy them. They have to have some ownership over them. And that's where the embeddedness comes in, you know? So I'm very fortunate that D. Soyini Madison brought me onto the planet and made sure that I went to Black schools with that her and her friends created in Chicago. I was very fortunate that she said, no, you're gonna go to a HBCU and let me tell you the 8,000 reasons why. So by the time I get to Yale, my nurturing, I'm good. So I can spot, you know, I can spot the institutional racism from a mile away, you know? So I'm a thief in the night, you know? So, you know, so I'm interested in, you know, these embedded spaces, you know, and continuing them, you know, and I'm willing to work with anyone who is on that page. You know, I'm with anybody, with any human that is on that page of liberation and justice and fairness. If you can get there, you know, if you can get there, if white people, if you can get yourself there, you know, in the mass way, if you can get yourself, I don't know, but if you can get yourself there, you know, that's what it means to have a beauty embedded in these kinds of things, you know, so, you know, I'm very fortunate to have experiences of spaces that, where I'm just fine, you know, as I am.
And what a wealth.
Yeah, yeah.
You're such a beautiful speaker. I don't know if you're looking in the chat. Maybe look at it at the end so you don't get shy. Our next question comes from our very own publisher, Fang Bui. Fang, you should be able to turn on your audio.
Torkwase, that was so beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm enjoying the whole conversations very much. I just want to ask a brief question. As ugly as America, the history of this culture, you know, there's an aspiration that strive towards a very, you know, unity, idea of democracy, whether civil disobedience from, you know, Laurel to Walt Whitman, to even the best pragmatist philosophy. For example, John Dewey talk about participatory democracy just as much, you know, Habermas talk about purpose sphere. And my question is that undoubtedly there's a sense of spirituality in your work. I think, so my question, how much growing up, whether you have gone to church, Torkwase, but they always, I remember there was a Black theology movement in the late 60s that trying to redefine what is meant, you know? And I wonder, there any kind of reference to that history at all?
So, so what, I think that I'll say this. My mother we tried everything. And I don't mean try everything. I mean, we went to the, Baptist church. We went to Trinity Church a couple of times, but we also experienced the Baha'i faith, right? We also experienced a kind of Christianity that was more conservative. So it was a condition where I grew up where spirituality was based on the generosity of the individual, but then how that generosity then transformed in the system of a group, right? So the idea of this individual making a sociality through spirituality was all based on, with my mother, how my mother led me and my brother through the world, was based on a kind of condition of justice and expressivity, right? Because we are all created in the history, the idea of a democracy in relationship to someone like a Walt Whitman, who shaped that from a very specific kind of conditioning, creativity, and language. Well, I was looking at Fred Hampton, right? So to think about a kind of knowledge and spirituality based on information, right? And the spirit, because when Fred got up to that mic, right? Yeah. And he spoke, that was an offering, right? That was, they knew that was, the person to turn it around. So the way in which these kind of conversations around spirituality and the global West in particular, and as it was spoken about earlier, they're spending the time in the Congo and the Congolese and these different, the many different Akan traditions and behaviors were all in our lives. We celebrated Kwanzaa, but more importantly, we lived through the Nguzo Saba all year. So this all was in relationship to, really, I'll say these Western conditions weren't the center point at any moment. So I didn't meet all of these other conditions until later, right? So what was I gonna say?
But is that how you were able to mobilize fluid movement against hot edge geometrical form? I think that there's some...
Oh, I see what you're asking. Let me think. Maybe my mother knew that dance, and I also grew up on the east side of Chicago, so I was very much at the country club, so I was very much in the beach. And I also, I think it was more about really lived experiences in Chicago, right? So my father, who was the president of Local 1, which was the Hotel and Restaurant Union in Chicago. So, his building that I went in as a child was very much a modernist kind of spread, and we don't know who the architect is, but with a knowledge around steel and I-beams and cantilevers. So I knew that this very powerful Black man who worked for a union and would talk to people and think about their welfare and fight for justice for them was related to that particular building. And then to go home and in the weekends go in the water, I think it's just the way, and then going down south, it's the experience of a free Black geography, I think, that makes it into the work. I don't think it has to do with conditions of canonized white philosophical meaning. I think that happened later. Right. So to acknowledge someone like Catherine McKendrick, who says, okay, well, these are Black geographies, this is what they look like, and they're under the umbrella, right, of a Western architectural domination. But in that, right, there has to be, because we're human and we're dope in that way, there is a level of I don't know, embodiment that she was talking about, that my mother and my father had us experience, right? So in a community that was built in, that makes it into the work. So my propensity towards a dialectical condition. So it's not just the hard geometry and the fluidity, it's really all of those things in between. Like it's really, if I was gonna say it, it's really about kind of state change, right? So as one is built in a world of color, where state change is, you know, everybody from Paul Williams to, you know, Ida B. Wells to Mama Ernestine to, you know, Baba Haki to whoever, you know, these are the kinds of conditions that, in Chicago at least, make it into my work. It's my system. So I just needed I needed the hyper shape as a way to, you know, bring something in and, you know, and create something else, and and what I'm describing to you is Black compositional thought, right? It's not me, it's the way it was, you know. So I don't want any part of any religion.
Yeah. Yep. One can be spiritual without being religious.
Yes. That's very true. Yes, very true.
Thank you. Excellent. Back to you, Malvika.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Phong, for your question. Torkwase, so much gratitude, not just from me, but from everyone here, present, not present, for just your like very deep and rigorous intelligence and generosity. This is my favorite one so far.
I'm so sorry it fell apart.
But you put it together so beautifully. I feel like we're all having really good vibes from this.
Okay.
So we've kept our poet waiting some time. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending lunch with a poem. We've carried that into these community events, which I'm very happy about. And today I'm so thrilled to welcome Gabriel Palacios to the stage. Gabriel Palacios is a Tucson, Arizona-based poet. His most recent work appears in or is forthcoming in Fugue, DREGINALD, the Laurel Review, and Poetry Northwest. He serves as an associate poetry editor at The Diagram and as a contributing editor at the Volta. Here to share with us his Volta, Gabriel. And you should be able to turn on your audio.
I think I'm unmuted now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm gonna share a poem. Thank you so much, Torkwase Dyson. And this is a poem called "The Sky City" that I'm going to read. That appeared in the Volta. The Sky City. It's from a cycle. Just to give a real quick preamble, I was thinking about old world's fairs as kind of like these dissolvable capsules of incomplete experience. And I've been thinking about fusing up memory and the spaces that are dynamic and disintegrating, and thinking about historic preservation and revitalized downtowns and what's underneath them. This is called the Sky City. I live up there in fast shadows of a top floor window woman pulling black hair from a brush. I'm warned that you don't live here by the child on the stairs who with his shard of parking lot concrete defends your pink apartments. And under that night's board helicopter, I have made the lunches for tomorrow. Once I dug a grave for someone's cat, slack eyes unheld by thin meteors of bone that float outside the socket. Always this gratuitous display of teeth we code as smile to even have survived somewhat, freak out in your sleep on a plane. Days I haven't slept enough, I'm summoned to the captain who built the house they took apart to make the bank of benches at the urgent care. Invisible light, the sun streaming in to the citadel on stolen horses. His table set with wooden steak chops, plastic peas. He's chewing something small like nuts and nodding at his suffocated embers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry, one moment. I wanted to say thank you so much to Gabriel. Thank you so much to Robert, who I did not know, but is indeed a phenomenal improvisational speaker. Thank you so much to Torkwase and all of you who are here and have been here. Feel free to turn on your microphone and say goodbye, shout out your thank yous, anything you want to say on your way out.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Torkwase.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriel.
This was great. Such a pleasure.
Love you, Torkwase.
Thank you, Torkwase.
Gabrielle, it was beautiful.
Thank you. Wonderful question.
Good to see you. Hey,
Thanks, everyone.
What? Candida. Hi. It was great.
Oh, I wanted to say thank you to Sheila.
Sheila, thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you.
See you again.
Thank you.
Sheila, looking forward to seeing you soon.